In Luke 6:46, which granted was not written down as Luke 6:46 when Jesus said this, but Jesus asked a question to his followers. He says, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do the things that I say?" And I think that question still applies to us today sometimes. Why do we call him Lord, Lord, and don't do the things that he says? Now, we've been looking for a couple weeks now at some of the influence that Jesus has and some of the things that Jesus taught. Actually, we've been looking for a very long time at the things that Jesus taught, but in particular, looking at some of the influence that he has. And I think a question that we want to answer is, why do the words of this man who lived 2,000 years ago, why do they still matter today? They're questions that, truthfully, I believe that we should be asking about anybody that we're going to listen to, whether it be Jesus who walked on the earth 2,000 years ago, or whether it be the YouTuber whose videos you're watching, the TikToker who you're listening to and you're following, whether it be the politician, whether it be your teacher in school. We should be asking the question, why is this person someone that we should be listening to? I've been reading recently 2 different books that are very, very different books. One is a book called How Jesus Became God by a man named Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman used to be a follower of Christ and now has walked away from his faith and is writing books about how basically it's all nonsense. It's all, or maybe nonsense isn't the word that he would use. He is a little bit more polite than that typically when he talks, but his books and his teachings are trying to disprove our ideas about Jesus. So this one in particular, How Jesus Became God, I'm not recommending it to people, but he walks through kind of how this idea of this man who lived 2,000 years ago, in our view, became to be considered God. His argument is that he wasn't considered that way at the time, but over time, we began to look at him that way. At the same time, I've been reading a book by a man named J. Warner Wallace, who you've heard me reference in here a couple of times. J. Warner Wallace is, not used to be, but he is a cold case detective for the city of LA. He has been featured on Dateline with the cases that he has helped to solve more than any other cold case detective in the history of Dateline. Going on, talking about how they figured out who done it and walking through their process of it. And he began several years ago to walk through, he was an atheist who began to walk through putting together the same skills that he had as a cold case detective, meaning going back and looking at cases that weren't solved, who, the person that was the person of interest, in this case, the name of the book, who, maybe that person was already dead, or the individuals who had the crime committed against them, they were long gone. But cold case detectives will go back and they'll try and solve these cases that were considered at the time unsolvable. So he took those same skills and he began to apply them to this man named Jesus. And, whether or not we can truly conclude that Jesus was indeed who we say that he is, who in Scripture we read that he says that he is, meaning the Son of God, the Son of Man, the Messiah, the Savior, God himself. Can we reliably rest on those words and trust in those words? And so he's begun to kind of lay that case out for people. He would be what would be considered to be an apologist. He is still a cold case detective for the city of LA. He is not fully retired. He is still using those skills and keeping up with them, while at the same time presenting a case for Christ. Now, 2 very, very different books. 2 very educated men with 2 very different landing points as to where they land with who this Jesus man was and who this Jesus man is. So as we see these types of people, we have a choice to make. Which one are we going to listen to? Which one are we going to look at and I believe that one is the correct one? See, I'm reading them both, so I guess you could argue that I'm hearing the words of both of them, but I have to make a decision because they cannot both be correct. They cannot both be telling the truth. They might be telling what they believe to be true, but they cannot both be telling the truth. And it is up to me as the reader to determine which one I am going to believe. And to do that, what I do is I begin to look at their credentials. I begin to look at their history. I begin to look at the claims that they're making and begin to dive deeper into those claims that they're making. Instead of just taking them at face value, begin to dive deeper to discover what other evidence is out there to support the claims that they're making. I believe those are the kind of things that we should do with the words of Jesus. Those are the kind of things we should do when we see that TikTok influencer get on and make bold claims, whether it be about an election, whether it be about medicinal things, whether it be about education, whatever it might be about. It is our responsibility to dig in and to determine whether or not this is somebody that we should listen to. Now, just because they have 500,000 followers is not the definitive reason as to why we should listen to somebody. It is nothing for a celebrity to get 1 million followers on social media. But that doesn't automatically make them qualified for what it is that they're giving their opinion on. Now, you may believe everything that I just said. You may believe none of what I just said. You may be sitting there going, no, the number of followers is absolutely the reason to listen to somebody. That is something that you have the right to believe, but we cannot both be correct. One of us is right, and one of us is wrong. And it's on both of us to take the time to figure out which one that is. Not as a competition with each other, not so that we can sit here and we can argue and I can, argue you under the bus or anything like that, but just so that we can take that responsibility and decide what we believe to be true, and we're going to have to land on that. Now, again, that's not saying that what you believe to be true is just completely up to you. Truth is truth, regardless of what you feel about it. But it's our responsibility to dig in. So, we're going to do that a little bit this morning. Why listen to this man who walked the earth with his hands, with his feet in the dust and his sandals 2,000 years ago? Why listen to this man? 2 weeks ago, we looked at the influence that he has on the calendar. This morning, I would like to take just a little bit of time, and I'm going to try and get through, it's a lot of stuff. I'm going to try and get through this next piece really quick. We're going to look at education. We're going to look actually at 2,000 years worth of education, and I'm going to try my hardest to look at 2,000 years of education in 5 minutes. I think Steve Berman, maybe it is. I think that's the wrong name. He's a sports guy. He goes through like the entire day of football in 3 minutes. I'm going to give myself 5 minutes to get through 2,000 years. So bear with me for a second. Students, I know this feels like you're in school. Sorry, it is what it is. All right, 1st century, all the way back. In the 1st century, I'm going to take my notes up here with me because let's face it, I didn't memorize all this stuff. It's a lot of stuff. So, and I'm not even going to try and act like I did. In the 1st century, we see formal schools being developed. So places where people would come. Now, I'm not saying that there was no schooling before and that there wasn't any kind of formality to it, but we began to see them change a little bit. Ignatius of Antioch, who was a student of John, a follower of Christ, said these words about education. He says, we are to raise children in the Lord, teach scriptures, and teach them the trades. And so they began to put these schools together. Justin Martyr, who was in the 2nd century, began to establish formal schools and establish them in particular in 2 cities, Ephesus and Rome. 2 center cities began to establish these formal schools. In these early centuries, we began to see formal educational curriculum being developed until a scholar by the name of Origen, who you may or may not have heard of, depending on, there's a lot of history that teachers have to teach, and they can't teach all of it, so maybe you heard about him, maybe you didn't. But Origen came along. He was a well-known scholar who, when he got to the school that he was at in the 3rd century, this school in particular had already begun to develop and hammer into math and science and grammar. So we begin to see in the very early centuries these formal schools being developed. We also, in our education journey, we see universal education being a big deal to a lot of people who put in a lot of work. And here's what I mean by universal education. I mean that there have been times where education was for the elite. Education was for those who grew up in the right family, and there began to be these men and women who said, no, education should be for everybody. A man by the name of Johannes Bugenhagen, which I know I butchered his name, pioneered the organization of schools. In the 17th century, a man named John Comenius, who is known as the father of modern education, advocated for universal education for everybody. Martin Luther came along and he argued that education and literacy should be even for those people that we invite to go back to MC Kids, the children. That they should have the opportunity to learn how to read and how to write. And John Calvin fought for, in his words, a system of elementary education in vernacular for all, including reading, writing, arithmetic, grammar, and religion. So not just if you speak the right language and you live in the right country, but for everybody, these things should be available. We began to see the schools go a little bit further in the grade advancement, meaning there was a time where everyone just kind of learns the same stuff. Well, we began to advance them through the grades. A man by the name of Johann Sturm in the 16th century advocated for grade advancement, for grade level advancement, which we're used to now. You start in one grade, you move your way up through the grades. Friedrich Froebel in the 18th and 19th century is considered to be the father of kindergarten education, meaning now those little kindergartners have an opportunity to learn at their level, not have to try and keep up with all the older kids that are around them. I know we're moving through this stuff really fast, and you're probably sitting there going, I'm not going to remember any of this. Truthfully, I'm okay with that, but I'm trying to make a point here anyway. So, hang on with me just a little bit longer. Several people began to see that books were important. That books were important in education. A man by the name of Benedict of Nursia, and we're going to go back a couple of centuries here, in the 6th century began to develop these things that we now call libraries, a place where all of this information came together. And Cassiodorus in the 6th century, as he saw the Roman Empire begin to crumble, helped to, quote, save the culture of Rome at a time of impending barbarism by collecting literature and making, again, a library. And as he saw all of this history being destroyed, he began to collect all these books, all these annals of what had happened, and bring them to one spot so that there would be a spot where you could go and you could find the information that you were looking for. And then in the 15th century, in 1448, an incredible invention came around that we still utilize today in a different form. Yes, it's advanced, called the printing press, when Johannes Gutenberg decided that education and teaching should no longer have to just be about the spoken word, but that instead we should be able to read it and everybody should be able to have it in their hands and not have to go to a certain spot to get access to it. It is considered one of the most important inventions in the history of mankind. Now, for those of you who don't like to read and who had to pick out a textbook in college that cost $300, you're probably thinking, I wish Gutenberg had never come up with that idea. But for the rest, considered one of the greatest inventions of all time. Two more things. We had several individuals come together and see the need to develop special needs curriculum, that they realize that not everybody's brain works the exact same way. So they began to develop things that would help out. And Charles Michael Day, he's French, let's just leave it at that, considered the father of education for the deaf in the 18th century, began to say, okay, there are people who can't hear, and we need to help them learn anyway. Laurent Marie Clerc in the 18th century also brought sign language to this country that we live in right now. Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet developed the first school for the deaf in the 19th century. And finally, a man by the name of Louis Braille, who you may have heard of at least that last name when you drive up, and I've never understood this, when you drive up to the drive-thru or the ATM and there's Braille on it, and I'm thinking, why is somebody who can't see driving their car up to, I realize there's really reasons, but that's how my brain works, was considered the father of education for the blind in the 19th century. We began to see that special needs education was vital for everybody to get the opportunity to universal education. And then we stop and look at some of these educational facilities, some of these prestigious universities that we still know, some of them today, others obviously have closed their doors. They've gone by the wayside. Places, that was a really bad S. Places like Canterbury, Rochester, York, the Beverly Grammar School. These are all early centuries, considered to be the oldest continually operating schools in the world. And then we get into some more well-known ones, at least to us, like Harvard and MIT and Stanford and Columbia and the University of and Princeton and Cal Berkeley and Penn and Chicago and Yale and the University of Michigan and the California Institute of Technology. All of these places, all of these ideas, all of these inventions, all of the men and women that came up with what I wrote on this board had one thing in common. Now, I'm not saying that everybody involved in them had this one thing in common, but the ones who are considered the fathers and the mothers of these particular things had one thing in common. It all comes down to a belief in one man. George Marsden, an American historian, wrote these words. He said, "One of the remarkable facts about American history is that within 6 years of landing in the Massachusetts wilderness, Puritans established what would soon become a reputable college. And this is directly from that college's student handbook. Let every student be plainly instructed and earnestly pressed to consider, well, the main end of his life and studies is to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life, John 17:3, and therefore to lay Christ as the only foundation of all sound knowledge and learning." Directly from its original student handbook, those were words from Harvard University. And these same men and women who formed Harvard began to form other schools like William and Mary and Yale and Princeton and Brown, no relation as far as I know, with the same founding purpose, that one's life and their pursuit of education, their pursuit of learning, would all point to one man. That one man being a man who had lived at the turn of the calendar, a man by the name of Jesus. J. Warner Wallace reports that 92% of the first 138 colleges and universities founded in America were begun for followers of this uneducated, itinerant, never wrote a book carpenter. All of these places that we consider to be like, if you can get in here, then you are the cream of the crop. You are the best of the best in the educational world, founded with the idea of pointing people towards Jesus by people who wanted to follow Jesus to the best of their ability. Now, I understand that not everyone involved in the founding felt the same way, but at its core, all of these prestigious universities, 92% of them, pointing to one man. J. Warner Wallace again says these words. He says, "From just these buildings and charters," so just the artwork in the buildings that you would walk through if you went to Harvard and Yale and William and Mary and Princeton, from the artwork and the architecture that you would see and the charters, at least especially the original charters from when the school began, you could reconstruct the historical truth about Jesus of Nazareth. Now stop and consider that for just a second, because that is not what we associate those schools with anymore. I understand that. But in their beginning, in their construction, in the idea phase of these schools being formed, all the architecture that was made pointed to this man. Whether it be a scene of his birth or a scene of his death on a cross or a scene of an empty tomb or a scene of him sitting around a table with his followers, the art pointed to this man, this guy who never had written a book, this guy who hadn't been a professor, this guy who had lived centuries before. And in their charters, you would begin to see bits and pieces of the gospel showing up, and bits and pieces of the invitation that Jesus would put out to follow him and what that meant to follow him, all through the pages and all through the artwork of these institutions, not to mention just looking back at what those institutions taught and what they did. Like the idea that we need people who can teach the deaf and who can teach the blind and who can teach those with special needs and who can teach those who are young and who are old. Teach them science, math, grammar, all pointing to one man. It is said that we're trying to remove Jesus from education, but I would say based on just, I haven't walked through them, but looking at pictures of these schools and reading through some of the charters, I would argue that to remove Jesus from education, you would have to remove the last 2,000 years of history of education itself. To remove Jesus from education, you would literally have to tear down buildings because he's all over them. His handprints are everywhere. Nobel Prize winner Max Planck, who won a Nobel Prize in physics, says this: "It was not by accident that the greatest thinkers of all ages were deeply religious souls." Church, it is only a recent phenomenon that education has chosen, I guess I need to go back to my own education, that education has chosen, and not all of education, let's be fair there, but that the reputation that some carry of education has chosen to try and point people away from Jesus. It is a recent phenomenon that science is suddenly at odds with Christianity. Because in reality, when we begin to run down the pursuit of truth and the pursuit of education, they aren't at odds with one another, but they point to one another. That the more we prove with science, the more we prove that Jesus is who Jesus said he was and is. Now again, you don't have to just believe me because I said it, and I realize that some of you don't. But I would encourage you, run this down. Choose who you're going to believe. Choose what you're going to believe and choose widely. Now, I understand some of the objections that people throw out there when it comes to, okay, all of these things, they were started and these people started these things. Well, of course they did, because back then everybody was Christian. But here's the thing, especially about those things in the first several centuries, Christianity was not the leading faith of the world. Today, it is the religion that the largest number of people claim to follow. About 2.4 billion people claim to be Christian. But in the first several centuries, that was far from the case. In fact, Hinduism was much more prevalent. Hinduism isn't all that far behind right now, but it was much more prevalent. It was an older faith that had a longer history, and yet we don't see nearly the influence of Hinduism in our education system or on any of it on our calendar, really, as far as the turning of our calendar. So it's not because everybody was Christian. It's not because it was the popular thing to do. And I understand the rejection that we have that... Sorry, let me take that one back. It's not just a matter of everyone who is doing it. But as we look deeper, we begin to see that, especially in education, this is not simply just a coincidence that a bunch of Christians came together and decided that they wanted to help people learn, but that Christianity itself is a catalyst for learning. Now again, I understand we live in a world where we're told that education and Christianity are at odds with one another, but Jesus himself, his influence is not just a coincidence upon education, but Jesus himself was a catalyst for learning. I want to look at two different moments in the life of Jesus. One of them goes back to when he was a 12-year-old boy, which, any of our 12-year-olds hang out in here? Any of you? Yeah. Oh, my daughter's 12. Whew, should have remembered that one. It's recent. Give me a break here. In Luke chapter 2, we see an instance where Jesus has gone to the temple with his parents, and his parents have left. Some of you understand this experience where you leave and you get a little ways down the road and you realize, we're missing a child. Anybody ever leave your child behind? Your worship pastor, Courtney, has shared that when she was young, she actually got left here at the church quite a bit. And sorry, Steve and Rhonda, I'm not trying to throw you under the bus here. And Pastor K would take her home because Pastor K is a very kind person like that. I've experienced the same type of thing. Several of you have experienced the same type of thing as you were a kid, or you forgot a kid. Well, Mary and Joseph, they're not driving down the road. They can't just turn around and go back as quickly. It takes them a little bit of time. But they realize, Jesus isn't here. They're looking all around like, hey, have you seen our son? Have you seen our son? And I was like, no, we haven't seen him since we were back at the temple. So they finally make their way back to the temple, and they see 12-year-old Jesus surrounded by all of the teachers in the temple, sitting down with them, engaging with them. And these are the words that are said about them. After 3 days, so 3 days looking for their child. I cannot imagine. I mean, imagine sitting there going, I lost the child of God. Like, this isn't just I lost my child. I lost the child of God. They found him in the temple complex, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Incredible. 12-year-old sitting there asking the best and the brightest all of these questions. And all those who heard him were astounded at his understanding and his answers. He's asking them questions, and they're sitting there going, I can't believe a 12-year-old just asked me that question. That is, oh my goodness. And then they're turning around and they're asking him questions, and they're going, I can't believe that a 12-year-old just gave that answer to that question. Like, I thought 12-year-olds could only watch a 15-second video. Like, I thought that's all the longer their concentration went. And this guy has been sitting with us for 3 days, answering and asking these deep, deep questions. And we'll sit here now, 2,000 years later, and we'll say, yes, but the topic was faith. And he was God. We have got to stop giving Jesus the excuse or making the excuse for him so that we don't have to measure up of him being God. He tells us himself that he gave up equality with God when he came and he walked with us. I would argue that us using the excuse that, well, Jesus was God and that's why he was able to do the things that he did, I would argue that that is tantamount to saying that an athlete is as good as they are because of the color of their skin and completely ignore the hard work that they have put into what they're doing. Completely ignore the dedication that they've put into their sport. Or I would argue that it's tantamount to saying that a child, a prodigy, is as intelligent as they are because, well, they grew up in the right country and they have the right nationality, and all of those people are smart. And ignore the effort that their parents and them, that they put in to learning the things that they learned. I would argue that it is tantamount to saying that that person's a bad driver simply because of their gender or their race. I know, that's a totally different aspect. I was going good. I decided to throw in a bad one there. I would argue that us using the excuse that Jesus was able to know the things he knew because he was God is tantamount to those things. Jesus spent time learning those things. We are told repeatedly that Jesus walked among us as one of us and gave up the equality that he had with his Father. In fact, to the point that he asked his Father to do some things different. I also want to look at Mark chapter 1 and verse 22. It says that they were astonished, and this is when Jesus is grown up. They were astonished at his teaching because, unlike the scribes, he was teaching as one who had authority. Now understand that the scribes weren't just some random people who knew a couple of things. The scribes were people who had put in all the effort to know all the things. And they looked at him different because he actually spoke like someone who knew what he was talking about. Who wasn't just, saying, well, the most recent book I read said this. I fall into that trap of actually just sharing somebody else's words, but instead he spoke as somebody who actually knew what it was that he was talking about. See, at this point, he'd been teaching for a little bit of time, but he was still relatively young when it came to being a rabbi. And I know there's the myth that the average age was about 30 to 35. If you start going back and you look at what was the average age in Rome, you can be like, no, Jesus was actually pretty old. Stop and consider. Soldiers died young. The infant mortality rate was incredibly high. And all of those things are considered when they consider the average age of a Roman citizen in the time that Jesus lived and walked on the earth. The average age of somebody who made it past infant mortality and who wasn't a soldier was closer to 60 to 65. So Jesus was still relatively young, and yet he was coming up against these people who had all of this experience in teaching, and he was the one that they were looking at going, there is something different about this man. And in Matthew 28, we see those passages, those verses that we quote so often when, the ones where he says, go and make disciples. Well, there's a part of what he says. He says, go and make disciples and teach them. That sounds like educational language, church. Teach them. Teach them about me. And so we begin to see all of these early followers that say we're going to teach people first and foremost about Jesus, but we're also, because Jesus wasn't afraid of education, we're also going to teach them about science, and we're going to teach them about math so that they can understand the world. In fact, when Jesus says, who builds a house and doesn't consider the cost? You understand he's saying, hey, you've got to be able to figure out what the cost is, and that's going to require you to be able to do a little bit of math and a little bit of figuring and a little bit of measuring. There's an argument out there that Jesus was not an intelligent person because he didn't write any books like Aristotle wrote books. There's an argument out there that his intelligence isn't measured by our standards, that, he might have been a genius in his day, but it's been 2,000 years. Don't we take the word of people who lived 2,000 years ago all the time? How long ago was it that they realized that the earth wasn't flat, and we still take their word for it, right? They're not wrong because they lived 2,000 years ago. Or this idea of gravity that we've been trying to beat. Just because he lived 2,000 years ago doesn't make him less intelligent. Our recency bias would say that, yes, we know more than everybody before us, but our logical, running it down logically, we have to admit that just because you live in an earlier age doesn't make you less intelligent. As somebody who's hit middle age now, who is no longer considered to be young, I'm realizing that maybe older people do know a thing or two. And when I was young, I thought I knew it all. But now I'm realizing there's a lot of things out there that I can learn. The evidence for Jesus' intelligence outweighs, in my estimation anyway, any ideas of him not being an intelligent person who didn't care about education system, even just looking at his teaching style and the way that he was able to connect with those who were young, he was able to connect with those who were uneducated, and he was able to teach and connect with those who had more education, you could say, in the system than he did. He was able to teach those who we would consider to be the lowest of the low and teach those who are the highest of the high. And any teacher will tell you that is a gift, to be able to teach people on so many different levels and connect with them on so many different levels. He was a man who taught with authority that suggested that he had mastered the material. And again, not just because he was God, but because he was a man who had put in the effort to master the material. He showed self-awareness. He showed empathy. He showed patience. He showed that he was able to control their emotions. And the more that psychologists and sociologists and all the other ologists study the brain and study the emotions, we understand that that is an intelligence all of its own. Jesus displayed educational and emotional intelligence. And his followers were inspired to launch many parts of the education system that we know today because of the man that Jesus was. Church, why listen to this man who lived 2,000 years ago? Why listen to this itinerant, never wrote a book carpenter This teacher who walked decades and centuries, millennia ago, why listen to his words now? Why would his words still matter today? I think we have to stop for a second. We have to ask, why did they matter then? Why did they matter to all the people who developed all of these things? Why was he so important? Why did his words mean so much to those people? Now, we could say it doesn't matter, but it's had such great influence on our lives. Shouldn't we at least take the time to ask the question of why has he mattered for the last 2,000 years when we're asking the question of why does he matter today? And I presented to you 2 weeks ago, I don't believe that Jesus is afraid of us asking that question. I think that Jesus would encourage us to ask that question. Why, Jesus, do your words still matter? And then as we begin to look at those words, I would encourage you to test the claims that he made. Last week we looked at his claim about forgiveness, his instruction about blessing those who curse us. And what we found, what we talked about, what others have found and discussed and presented, and we have to decide if we believe it or not, is that the act of forgiveness actually has health benefits. That this man who lived 2,000 years ago was onto something before he ever had the research capabilities that we have today to discover it. Test the claims that he made and see which ones, as you really run them down, come back as incorrect. But also, church, I would encourage you to look at the influence that he has had on the world in which we live. Don't laugh at my art. He had a lot more influence on art than I had on art. Let's just leave it that way. Last week, or 2 weeks ago, we looked at the influence that he had on our calendar. We've looked at the influence that he had on education that no other man in history can say that they have had even remotely the same type of influence on these things. Has Einstein had influence on education? Oh, yeah. But it doesn't touch the kind of influence that Jesus has had. It doesn't touch the number of universities that have been founded in his name, the architecture that has been made in his name, the art that has been put up in his name. It doesn't hold a candle to it. So if this man has had all this influence, church, I have to ask the question, why would we not want to find out why? He still impacts our lives today throughout the course of history. And no matter how much we want to try and erase him or people want to try and erase him from history, you would literally have to begin tearing down the buildings. And you would literally have to begin burning the books. No man has had more songs sung about him, whether on the positive or the negative side. No man's name is used more as a curse or as a blessing, but the influence is still there. No man or woman's influence can hold a candle to the influence that this man has had. And it behooves us to ask. And then, as we run that down and as we discover what I believe you'll discover in that, then we have to consider his question that we started with. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, but you don't do the things that I tell you? And it falls on us. It falls on us to discover what things is he talking about in my life that he's told me that I'm not doing. Do I call him Lord, Lord, and not do the things that he says? Do I call him Lord, Lord, and not even know the things that he says? Because if you don't know them, there's a good chance you're probably not doing them also. This itinerant never wrote a book, never went to Princeton, carpenter turned teacher from 2,000 years ago, continues to influence our lives today. And church, I want to know why. And I hope that you want to know why. And like I told you 2 weeks ago, if you're looking for ways to figure it out, I would love to walk through that with you. I'm not going to recommend how Jesus became God to you, because as I have run down the claims made in these 2 books, and yes, I understand I was biased when I started, but I found the claims in this book to be the accurate claims. I would recommend this one. In fact, you'll see some of this information in this book. I've given him credit where I took his stuff, I promise. Don't just give it 30 minutes to 40 minutes, depending on how long I went on a particular day. Don't just give it 30 to 40 minutes to determine whether or not he's worth giving influence in your life today. Make it a weekly thing. Make it a daily thing. Make it an hourly thing. And don't try and do it alone, church. Don't think that you have to find all the answers. Don't think that AI is going to give you all the answers. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and don't do the things that I tell you? Why listen to this man from 2,000 years ago? It's a question that we all have to answer.